Welcome to the Lentil Intervention Podcast, talking all things movement, whole food nutrition and environmental wellness with your hosts, Ben and Emma.
Hello everybody, my name is Ben Eidelberg.
And I'm Emma Strutt.
And welcome to Season 2's Episode 24. As always, bit of admin. If you're listening to this on a podcast app, please make sure you hit the subscribe button. And once you finish listening, share it with your friends and family. And as well, if you do find our content interesting and inspiring, please do buy us a coffee. All the details on our website. Now, following on from a very, very recent guest, Professor Ian Shaw, and a very particular conversation around estrogen mimicking effects of soy, we thought we needed to go a little bit deeper into that, and we have a fascinating guest on that.
All right, so today we are extremely lucky to have an internationally recognised soy expert joining us for a chat, Dr. Mark Messina. Mark is Executive Director of the Soy Nutrition Institute in the US, is an adjunct associate professor at Loma Linda University, and is co-owner of Nutrition Matters, Inc. Mark is a former program director with the National Cancer Institute and has spent the last 30 years researching the health effects of soy foods and soy isoflavones. So we're in for a treat today with the wisdom that Mark brings to the table on this very hot topic. Dr. Messina, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Now, as always, with all our guests, we like to get to know a little bit about them, their background, and in particular with yourself, how and why did you get down the path into a very specific topic that is soy?
Well, I think it's actually an interesting path that I took because I became a vegetarian in 1972 because my martial arts instructor said my martial arts would improve if I became a vegetarian. Now, I think has no scientific basis, but that was long before I had any formal education in nutrition. Nevertheless, I became a vegetarian. Fast forward about 15 years, and I was working for the National Cancer Institute, and my responsibility there was to identify areas in the cancer prevention field that looked promising, and then I went through a process to try to make funding available for research in that area. In 1989, a future colleague of mine presented some research showing that soybeans may prevent the development of breast cancer. The head of the National Cancer Institute, this is in the States, of course, the head of the NCI wrote the branch I was working in a note asking if we were doing anything with soy because he heard this very interesting presentation about soybeans preventing the development of breast cancer. The secretary in the branch saw the note, saw the memo, and she knew that I ate soy because I was a vegetarian. So she said, "Why don't you do something in this area?" And I said, "Well, that seems pretty intriguing." And within about 6 months, I had organized a workshop, brought together about 12 experts in the soy area. And the findings from that workshop led to the National Cancer Institute funding research looking at the role that soy may have in cancer prevention and treatment. So I became fascinated with soy. I was eating soy as part of my vegetarian diet, but now I became interested in it from a professional perspective. And I soon learned that soy may not only help to prevent the development of various types of cancers, but there was intriguing evidence that it could reduce risk of heart disease and osteoporosis, maybe alleviate hot flashes. And so after a few more years working at the National Cancer Institute, I decided to go off on my own because all I really wanted to do was to focus on soy. And about 30 years later, I'm still doing it.
Yeah, so, I mean, soy foods, they're traditional staples in certain Asian diets. As you mentioned, vegetarians consume it as a staple as well. They've been really thoroughly researched for the last 30 years in regards to health, but, you know, they continue to be dogged by myths and misinformation. So, Mark, if you don't mind explaining, why is this? Why did all this controversy start in the first place? And just on that, actually, when I was reading one of your recent papers, I was really surprised to see that the controversy has some roots in Australia.
Yes, yes. So, well, first of all, the reason for the controversy is because soy is a uniquely rich source of a group of naturally occurring compounds called isoflavones. And isoflavones are commonly classified as phytoestrogens or plant estrogens. And most of the research that has taken place over the past 30 years has focused on these isoflavones and their potential health benefits. But of course, like any compound and like the hormone estrogen, it makes sense to ask whether there are any adverse effects. Because we know that estrogen increases risk of certain types of cancers and can increase blood clot formation. So I think it's perfectly reasonable that concerns have been raised. Fortunately, and obviously we'll cover all this, fortunately, when you look at the human data, you see that soy is perfectly safe. And I would say, with the exception of those who are allergic to soy, and that's about 3 adults out of every 1,000, the evidence is very clear that soy foods are safe. But there are about 40,000 scientific papers on soy. There are about 2,000 scientific papers published each year that relate to soy. So if you cherry pick the data, it's actually easy to make a very convincing case that soy may be harmful. Now, I'm not all suggesting that people that are raising these concerns are doing so for unjustified reasons. I mean, we could go through the literature with breast cancer, puberty onset, and hopefully we'll have time to do that. What I am saying, though, is that the concerns are primarily based on the results of animal studies. And with a lot of compounds that are claimed to have adverse effects, you're not actually able to do clinical trials. That's not the case with soy, because there's literally been hundreds of clinical trials. These are intervention studies where you might feed one group soy or the isoflavones and another group a different type of food, say dairy products, or a placebo. So we have hundreds of clinical studies that we can draw upon to base our conclusions about health effects. And then we have lots and lots of observational studies. And I know this is a long-winded answer, so I apologize, but you mentioned Australia, and that's true. The controversy actually started in New Zealand, in Australia, back in the early 1990s. Few people realize this because it happened so long ago, but a parrot breeder in New Zealand claimed that his birds died because there was soy in the bird feed. This led him to commission, is too strong of a word, to commission a report on soy. The person who wrote the report, and it wasn't published, it wasn't a very sophisticated report, identified a number of anti-nutrients in soybeans. And this really led to the soy controversy back in the mid 1990s. And it really focused on soy infant formula more than anything else. And that's understandable because if infants are using soy formula, which has been around for many, many decades, but if infants are using soy formula, they're going to be exposed to a large amount of isoflavones. And this is a very sensitive period of life. So I think it was reasonable that these concerns were raised. But again, if you look at the clinical studies, they're very supportive of safety. So the controversy started in Australia, and then one sort of an activist group in the US took the lead role and wrote many, many articles about the harmful effects of soy. They were not scientifically grounded. There were a lot of, I'll just say, misstatements. And I will acknowledge that even when it was pointed out to them that the information they were conveying was incorrect, they still continued to convey that misinformation. But they were very influential, and they had, to this day, they've had a huge impact on the perception of soy. That's not to say that there weren't some scientific developments that arose that did raise legitimate questions about soy. That was mostly beginning in the late 1990s, where a certain type of animal model raised concern that soy may actually worsen the prognosis of women with breast cancer. And that was had a huge impact on the perception of soy and even the science, the research, because a lot of the interest in soy early on, especially, was because it was thought that soy may reduce the risk of developing breast cancer. And here was animal research suggesting that soy may actually worsen the prognosis of breast cancer patients. And it wasn't for about another decade that research began to be published showing not only that soy was safe for women with breast cancer, but research was published suggesting that women who consumed soy after a diagnosis of breast cancer were actually less likely to suffer a recurrence of their disease, or to die from their disease.
It's interesting, the timing, because you talk a lot about a lot of the myths that started around the 90s, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but for a lot of us, a popular book that a lot of our listeners and Em and I have read is The China Study by Dr. T. Colin Campbell, and he makes mention of some of the epidemiological studies that showed that the Asian populations that consumed more soy products had lower rates of breast cancer. So that wasn't per se clinical studies, but I guess there was already a correlation shown that, populations, very high consumption of soy, and didn't seem to have a lot of those health effects that were perceived to be an issue. So that seemed to be around the 70s, perhaps even 80s, that was coming out?
Yeah, the China study came out actually when I was at the National Cancer Institute, so in the late 1980s. It was started before that, but and at the time it was heralded as an important study. To be perfectly honest, I don't put a lot of stock in the China study, and the important question is not whether countries that consume soy have lower rates of breast cancer. I mean, that's an interesting observation, and it generates a hypothesis which you can test through more robust means than just looking at these sort of cross-country comparisons. What's more informative is asking whether women in China or Japan who consume soy have less breast cancer than women in those countries who don't consume soy. And you really can only do those kind of studies in Japan and China, soy food consuming countries, and then you can look at vegetarians in the EPIC Oxford study in England, and then the Adventist Health study in the United States, because they include large numbers of vegetarians. If you look at a general population in Australia or in the United States, soy consumption is relatively low. And the other concern is that if you're eating even though tofu has become increasingly mainstream, but if you're eating tofu and drinking soy milk on a regular basis, there's a decent chance that you're going to be doing other things that promote health. You may be exercising more, going to the doctor more often. And although epidemiologists try to control for all those variables, it's very, very difficult to do that. So I like the Asian studies more, because if you're eating soy in Asia, it doesn't really make you unique or very different from your neighbor. Now, the concern there is epidemiologists don't like to extrapolate from one culture to another. And as long as we're on the subject of breast cancer, I do think that soy reduces breast cancer risk, but I'm pretty convinced that in order for soy to reduce breast cancer, it needs to be consumed during childhood and or during the teenage years. And that's a very important point. And that's why I strongly recommend that all girls consume at least one serving of soy per day. The observational studies suggest one serving per day is associated with a pretty significant reduction in breast cancer risk. Now, these are observational studies, aren't designed to show cause and effect, but because soy is a very nutritious food, there's no downside to it. I feel really good about recommending that girls consume one serving per day because of the potential benefit many years later.
Yeah. So safe as far as breast cancer risk goes, safe for breast cancer survivors as well, even if they're estrogen positive.
Yeah. There's two forms of data. The observational studies, where again the most, I think, impressive results come from a statistical analysis of 5 studies involving over 11,000 women with breast cancer, and it showed that about a 16% reduction in recurrence and a 24% reduction in survival for those women who consumed soy after a diagnosis of their disease. Again, that's observational data. If you look at the clinical studies, the actual intervention studies, which of course carry the most weight within the scientific community, those studies are completely supportive of safety. Now, they do not show benefit, but they show safety. So if you take healthy women or women at risk of breast cancer or even breast cancer patients and give them large amounts of soy, either in the form of soy foods or the isoflavone, the phytoestrogen supplements, you see no adverse effects on breast tissue. And that was the conclusion of the German Research Foundation and the European Food Safety Authority. So the clinical studies are supportive of safety. The observational studies are supportive of benefit. So in my opinion, that controversy has been fully refuted. And you start to see that in just sort of social media and internet. You see a lot more blog posts and just other types of social media highlighting these studies, whereas 10 years ago that certainly wasn't the case. I think the other big concern and sort of myth, I'll say, is the idea that soy feminizes men. And that's one that I'm personally and professionally interested in because I consume at least 2 servings of soy on a daily basis.
Yeah, so on that, some men do worry that consuming the phytoestrogens might reduce their testosterone levels or, make them need a training bra, for example. And I think we can kind of thank Men's Health magazine a little bit for perpetuating that thinking. So any truth to this?
Yeah, there is truth to it. The truth is that Men's Health is certainly more. This is a very popular magazine in the U.S. and they published just a terrible, irresponsible article in 2009, and they asked. It was on soy, of course, and they asked whether soy undermines everything it means to be male. And I will note that I called the editor after that article was published, and I said, "You didn't interview any soy experts," and we were butting heads. And finally, I don't want to say it was the editor. I'm not sure. It could have been an assistant editor, but the person I was talking to for Men's Health said, "We have to come out with an article every single month. An exciting article every single month." And I think that happens with nutrition. A lot of times the sort of media coverage is a lot sexier than the science dictates. In any event, I will give them credit because in 2015, so like 6 years later, they said they probably exaggerated the findings. And in 2018, they had an article about tofu being the new king of protein. And in 2019, they actually apologized very short, very briefly, but apologized for their take on soy. But, I understand why men would be a little freaked out about soy because obviously estrogen is the female reproductive hormone. You associate estrogen with women, and soy isoflavones are classified as phytoestrogens. So I think early on, the scientific community did not do a good job differentiating the isoflavones from estrogen. And sometimes they can have effects opposite to estrogen. A lot of times they're not going to have any effects in tissues that are affected by the hormone estrogen. But what you really need to do is the clinical studies, and they're not that hard to do. They're a little expensive, and just feed soy to men and see what happens to testosterone levels. And so in 2010, I was part of a statistical analysis, a meta-analysis looking at the clinical trial data, and we showed very clearly there were over 30 studies that soy did not lower testosterone levels in men. And then just, I guess it was last year, we published an update to that analysis. So now there were 40 studies, almost 2,000 men in these clinical trials, no effect on testosterone levels, and also no effect on estrogen levels. And your listeners may not realize that men make estrogen as well as women do. It's important for men, and older men actually make more estrogen than older women do. So we looked at both testosterone and estrogen, and there were no effects on either hormone. 3 clinical studies have shown no effects of soy on sperm or semen parameters. And also, we know that soy is a good protein if you want to build muscle in response to weightlifting, resistance exercise training. There was a meta-analysis published a couple of years ago now, and it showed that soy performed as well as whey protein, which is part of milk protein, and performed as well as other animal proteins. There were these short-term studies, acute studies, that looked at muscle protein synthesis just over a 4-hour period. Those studies showed that soy did not perform that well, but muscle protein synthesis goes on for a lot more than 4 hours after you exercise. So what you really need to do is look at the long-term studies, 10, 12 weeks, and look at not muscle protein synthesis, but actually gains in muscle mass and strength. And those studies show that soy performs just as well as whey protein.
And I think one of the popularities of whey protein is when you look at the effects, say 4 hours post-exercise, is because it's the, stand to be corrected, but the quickest absorbing. So hence its popularity. But with other proteins like soy, perhaps it just takes longer to absorb, but the benefits are still there. And like you say, it's not worse or inferior to other proteins. It's as beneficial. It doesn't have to be better, but it's as beneficial. But on that point, are we talking about, protein isolate, so soy isolate, or are there more benefits to have whole food as such? So we're consuming all the actual phytonutrients as well, and the fiber, etc. Is there a difference between the two?
Yeah, so I'll comment on that. But first, let me say that the reason there was so much focus on whey was because it's really high in leucine, which is an essential amino acid. It's called a branched chain amino acid. And that does seem to be an important trigger for muscle protein synthesis. Most proteins like soy are about 8% leucine. Whey is, depending on the source of whey, but it can be 12%, 13% leucine. So if leucine is important, then whey is going to be a very important protein for building muscle. But again, that is an interesting theory, but what matters is the clinical studies and looking at gains in muscle mass and strength. And those really now indicate that type of protein is probably not nearly as important as once hypothesized or once thought. And it's really the amount of protein that is critical for gains in muscle mass and strength. And I would say, and I'm not an expert in the area, but people wanting to bulk up probably need twice as much protein as the general population. So in the States and most places around the world, the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. So for people wanting to bulk up, it's about 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight. And I'm actually a big supporter of protein. I think, the data aren't definitive by any means, but I'm an older man. I'm 68, and I think it's really important for overall health to maintain your muscle mass as much as possible. Because when you look at, it's so depressing, don't get old. No, there's some benefits to get to aging for sure, but one of them is not muscle mass, because when you look at what happens in men and women, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the amount of muscle mass is dramatic. And same thing with strength. The decrease in strength is even greater. So you want to keep as much muscle mass as possible. So I do eat a fairly high protein diet, and I weight lift to try to keep my muscle mass. So the clinical studies use mostly the isolated protein in powder form. And the reason for that is because it's easier to incorporate into the diet. And you can give control a powdered form of like dairy protein, milk protein, and in a powdered form, and then compare that with the soy protein. So it's easier to get larger amounts into the diet, and it's less disruptive to the diet than it would be if you were eating tofu. And also it's easier to blind the subjects, so they may not know which protein they're consuming. Whereas if you're giving tofu, it's hard to come up with the control protein for that. So most of the studies, the clinical studies, have intervened with either the protein or the isoflavone supplement, sort of in pill or tablet form. The observational studies mostly are informative about soy foods because the observational studies come from free living populations in Japan and China, and they're not consuming soy protein isolate; they're consuming tofu. In terms of the isolates and the supplements and the whole foods, just like any nutritionist would recommend apples over apple juice, certainly apple juice over apple pie, I recommend whole soy foods. Edamame, soy nuts, tempeh, tofu. It's not exactly a whole food. Soy milk made from whole soybeans. But from an experimental perspective, it's very difficult to use those foods. Also, I eat a lot of more of the processed soy. I eat a lot of soy burgers because they are so convenient. And I have no cooking skills. Fortunately, my wife is not only a vegan expert, she's a dietitian, master's degree. She loves to cook, so we have a good arrangement there. But for lunch, it's very often that I'm going to have like a soy burger because it takes like 1 minute and 3 seconds, and I'm ready to eat. So I think all these foods fit into the diet. Obviously, the emphasis should be on the whole foods as much as possible, but those other foods are very convenient. And also, I love the new generation of not just soy burgers, but all of the plant burgers, because I think it makes it easier for omnivores to begin to adopt a more plant-based diet. Because, a soy burger is not competing with a kale salad. It's meat versus a soy burger. And in my opinion, the new generation taste fantastic, and the actual taste panels, support my view on this. And I think if we're going to get more people to, make the transition to a plant-based diet, I think these soy burgers and plant meats and plant milks are going to have a very important role.
Yeah, excellent transition foods there. But as you say, once you've transitioned, more whole foods is fantastic. Now, you mentioned aging before and sarcopenia and muscle mass, and obviously muscles are very important for bone health as well. And there's been a lot of buzz in the plant-based world about, our kind of diet and bone health over the last year or so. So in regards to bone mineral density and osteoporosis risk, can soy be a friend or a foe, or are they pulling a Switzerland and remaining neutral as far as this is concerned?
It's a good question. And, there have been some data looking at vegan bone mineral density and vegan fracture risk. And some of those studies have been a little bit discouraging. But I will say that the most recent analysis showed that if your vitamin D and calcium intake is where it should be, then the increased fracture risk disappears, is eliminated. One of the first areas I really began to focus on when I started to study soy was bone health. And the reason is because there was a very popular theory that the certain type of amino acids that are predominant in animal products, the sulfur amino acids, actually cause bone loss. And soy is a very high quality protein, but it's a little bit lower in the sulfur amino acids than animal protein. So the theory was that if you replaced soy with animal protein, if you replace animal protein with soy, that you would excrete less calcium and be good for your bones. Some of the early work supported that. That theory has not panned out. I think actually protein in general has either a neutral effect or a slight beneficial effect. The real interest has been on the focus has been on the isoflavones because they are plant estrogens. When women transit through menopause, they can lose an awful lot of bone mass because of the decrease in estrogen. So there were a lot of clinical trials indicating that isoflavones could either, and or I should say, slow bone loss and increase bone formation. So that was pretty exciting work. But then there were these 4 long-term trials that were conducted, and only one out of the 4 trials. So these are trials that were 2 to 3 years. The shorter trials are looking at oftentimes indicators of indicators of bone health, like bone formation and bone breakdown. So they're looking at these markers of bone health. Whereas what you really want to look at, of course, is bone mass and eventually fracture risk, but that takes a very long trial to look at fracture risk or actually number of fractures. So only 1 out of the 4 trials actually showed that isoflavones were beneficial. So unfortunately, I had so many beautiful slides that I showed in my presentation, and I really don't discuss that area very much, but the most recent statistical analysis looking at the shorter term studies was very encouraging. So I would say I'm on the fence right now. It's definitely not harmful. And also the calcium from calcium fortified soy milk and calcium set tofu is as well absorbed as the calcium is from cow's milk. And that's interesting because, there are components in plants, phytate and oxalate, that inhibit the absorption of calcium. And soy is really high in both phytate and oxalate, and yet you still see the absorption of calcium from tofu and fortified soy milk being as good as the absorption is from cow's milk. And then it's high quality protein. So I think soy can have a beneficial role for bone health. I'm just not sure what's going on with the isoflavones because the data are very inconsistent. I'm hoping eventually we see some stronger, more robust data, but now we can't reach any conclusions about the effects of isoflavones.
And I know there's been a bit of back and forth in the research on this particular topic, but do we have any clear answers yet regarding soy and menopausal symptoms like hot flushes?
Yes, I have a clear answer, I think, and so you're correct. If you look at most of well, let me just say the first study was actually conducted by Alice Merkes in 1995 from Australia. So that was the first clinical study to actually look at the impact of soy on hot flashes or hot. Do you go hot flushes or flashes there?
Whatever you want to run with, we'll run with.
Okay, good. In most places, Americans do hot flashes, but everywhere else, I think it's hot flushes. So I don't know what I'll say in the next minute or two. But so there was some encouraging data, and it was proposed in 1992 by a famous isoflavone researcher from Finland, Herman Adlercreutz, that isoflavones may alleviate hot flashes. And this hypothesis was based on the fact that isoflavones possess some estrogen-like activity and that there was a low prevalence of hot flashes among native Japanese women. I don't think the Japanese comparison is very relevant. In any event, you got to do the clinical trials, as I've tried to stress. And there have been probably 30 clinical trials that have examined the effect of isoflavones. And the studies were all over the map, and most of the reviews and analyses concluded maybe isoflavones will have a modest benefit, or others concluded that the data were sort of equivocal and couldn't really make any definitive conclusions. The problem is that there were 2 types of supplements that were used in these clinical trials. So you can really only use the pills in the clinical trials, or most trials use the pills because hot flushes are recorded by the individual woman in the study, by the participant. So it's a subjective assessment. So it's very important that the women in these studies are blinded. They can't know whether they're consuming soy or a placebo, isoflavones or a placebo. So in this case, it helps to use the pills, and it's also a lot easier. And the hypothesis was that if soy reduces hot flushes, it's going to be because of the isoflavones. In other cases, we don't know what component of soy might be responsible for a hypothesized effect, so you need to use the whole food. But in the case of hot flushes, it was definitely just the isoflavones. So there were two types of isoflavone supplements used. One type of supplement is made from the whole bean, and it has an isoflavone profile. There are 3 isoflavones in soybeans. And in those pills, the isoflavone composition mimics the isoflavone composition of the bean itself. Another type of supplement was made from the hypocotyledon portion of the bean, soy germ, that has the 3 isoflavones, but in a very different composition. What we did in 2012 was to statistically analyze the data. Over 1,000 women were involved in these studies. And we saw that the pills that had the isoflavone profile, that mimicked the isoflavone profile in soybeans, were very effective, would lower hot flushes by, frequency and severity by over 50%. The pills that were made that had a very different type of isoflavone profile from the bean itself were relatively ineffective. And that was the first analysis to actually sub-analyze the data, because these are 2 different chemical entities. And so I'm pretty convinced that isoflavones alleviate hot flashes, and the amount you need is about 50 milligrams per day, and that's not going to mean much to your listeners, but that's the amount provided in about 2 servings of traditional soy food. So in a serving or of a traditional soy food, there are about 3.5 milligrams of isoflavones per gram of protein. So if you consume a cup of soy milk that's got 7 grams of protein and it's made from whole soybeans, 7 times 3.5 is about 25. So there are about 25 milligrams in a serving of a traditional soy food. Could be 100 grams of tofu, an ounce of soy nuts. That's enough to alleviate hot flashes, according to this data.
There just seems to be so many, it's almost like the 7 wonders of the world. It's the 7 wonders of the soy, because there's a lot that we're still trying to understand, trying to learn, but there's so many positives. And one thing I saw in a presentation of yours on YouTube, not live, is you mentioned BPA and the ability to protect against the effects of, or the absorption of BPA. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, not much, but there was one study illustrating that was the case, and it also was related to fertility. And so there was actually a concern, believe it or not, this is in some ways pretty ironic, that soy may impair fertility. And, the flippant answer is, well, what are you saying? China would have 10 billion people instead of 1.4 billion people if they didn't consume soy. It's hard to get too worked up about that. But again, that's first of all, as a bit of an aside, many areas of China consume very little soy. People are often surprised to learn that, but in Japan, it's much more homogeneous. The amount of soy you consume in northern Japan is similar to the amount in the south, but China is just a huge country, a lot of different culinary regions, and in some regions, very little soy is consumed. But in any event, you can't rely on those kind of data, and there were some concerns that soy might impair fertility, because back in the mid-1990s, there was some research showing that soy increased the length of the menstrual cycle, and that people were hypothesizing that it might prevent ovulation. Now, none of these studies showed it prevented ovulation, but there was this concern. Longer cycles are actually associated with a lower risk of breast cancer. So now we've looked at, in men, certainly there's no effect on sperm or semen. Seems to not be any adverse effects in women. They Soy doesn't lower estrogen levels in women, has very minor effects on other reproductive hormones. But in this one study, it did show that exposure to the plasticizer, or BPA, which is an endocrine disruptor, and we can talk about endocrine disruptors if you like, actually was inversely related to fertility among women. So if you had higher amounts of BPA in your urine, you were less likely to become pregnant, whereas that relationship did not hold if you were actually also consuming isoflavones. So, it's just one study. It's an interesting observation. I really try to uh, base all my statements about soy on the clinical data. I think that observational data, if you look at the hierarchy of evidence, you have like in vitro cell studies at the bottom, and then animal studies, and then observational studies. And there's several kinds of observational studies. Some are much more credible than others, and then the clinical studies, and then statistical analyses of the clinical studies. So at this point, soy's been researched pretty heavily over the past 30 years. So generally, when I'm making a statement about soy and basing it on the clinical trial data, because everything else is really just speculation. So if you find an interesting observational finding, say, hey, let's see if we can design a study to confirm this finding.
So let's talk about soy and heart health for a second here. Some of our listeners will be familiar with the portfolio diet and its cholesterol lowering effects. And of course, soy is traditionally a key component of that diet. I'm sure we've also got some quite strict whole food plant-based eaters tuning in that are a little bit hesitant about consuming too much soy because of the fat content in that particular bean compared to other legumes. And then I know the FDA were also reviewing their stance on soy and heart health claims recently. So mixed messages there online. As you stated before, oftentimes it's coming from blogs rather than clinical research. So to date, what does the clinical data actually show regarding soy and heart health?
Actually, can I jump in with one question here? Because it's never been brought up, but it's something that's occurred to me when we're talking about other plant-based diets in general. Do you think there's anything to do with the dairy industry or the beef industry also sending out these confusing messages, just to add to that, all these confusing messages that we're trying to bust here?
So my degree is in nutrition, and how do I say this? I actually don't think so. I mean, they promote the dairy. They have a lot of money. I mean, way more money than the plant people do, and they promote their products. And I'm sure the beef industry and the dairy industry won't shy, do not shy away from highlighting a study that may negatively portray a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet. But I don't think that the controversy about soy has anything to do with the beef or dairy industry. And, from my perspective, I just look at the science, and I just try to, my focus really for the past 30 years, I was trained as a researcher. I was trained as an animal researcher. I don't think animal studies are very helpful. Aside from the ethical considerations, I don't think they provide much insight into human nutrition. So I spend all my time reading research, and I try to convey that research to other health professionals that don't have time to read the research. So that's really where my focus is. I do want to take this opportunity to say I am not a low-fat guy by any stretch of the imagination. I think that emphasis is very much misplaced, and I have a concern about it because I think in some cases it may dissuade people who associate a plant-based diet with a low-fat diet and find that a low-fat diet is not very appealing. So I don't like the emphasis on low-fat diets. I don't think the data are supportive of low-fat diets. I think what matters is the type of fat that you consume. It's true. It's interesting. The soybean is actually a very high in fat. It's an oil seed. It's different from some of the other pulses or legumes or beans. Soybeans get, like 40% of their calories from fat. Most beans are almost fat-free, and I eat a lot of beans. You can have a happy life without soy. I eat a lot of legumes in general, but I do eat a couple servings of soy every day, in part because it's so ridiculously convenient. I mean, there's so many different forms of soy, and I find myself sometimes thinking, I'm relying too much on soy because I'm being lazy, and we need to eat some other types of beans. Every food has something to offer. So I'm not a low-fat guy, and in fact, I just wrote a paper on soybean oil, and I can send you that if you're interested. I think the polyunsaturated fat lowers risk of heart disease, reduces blood cholesterol levels, doesn't increase inflammation. That's a misunderstanding. Doesn't increase oxidative stress. And also with some of the soy products, of course, that like the portfolio folks use at the University of Toronto, they're often using the isolate and some of these more processed products that can be much lower in fat. The soy protein itself lowers blood cholesterol levels. So the first clinical study showing that soy protein lowered blood cholesterol was published in 1967. And then in 1995, a statistical analysis of all the clinical trials was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. It showed about a 13% reduction, which was a huge amount because that was before the widespread use of statins, which are the drugs that are very effective at lowering cholesterol levels. 4 years later, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a health claim for soy foods and heart disease based on the cholesterol-lowering effects of soy protein. Over the years, the cholesterol-lowering effects have been challenged. The FDA is currently actually reviewing the evidence in support of the health claim. I would say if you look at the data, the most recent analysis, and it actually was done from the portfolio folks, David Jenkins and colleagues who published a meta-analysis in 2019 showing about a little 3 to 4% reduction in cholesterol in response to soy protein. Now, that's not a huge effect. That's why he uses the portfolio diet, because you use soy protein and nuts and fruits and vegetables and phytosterols and lots of fiber, and you can get 20-30% reductions in cholesterol, which is really what you need if you're going to meaningfully reduce your risk of heart disease. So I think that soy has a modest cholesterol lowering effect. It's important. Remember also, if you are an omnivore and you end up eating soy foods instead of some foods that are high in saturated fat, you're going to get a double benefit. You're going to get the benefit of the change in fatty acid content of your diet, also a direct effect of soy protein. And in fact, the one and only David Jenkins, an amazing researcher, has been doing, David Jenkins from the University of Toronto has been publishing amazing research for 40 years. He published research on the glycemic index in 1981. I mean, my gosh, what an amazing individual. So I'm sorry for that digression there. But the other thing is that there is some evidence that at least in postmenopausal women, the isoflavones directly improve the health of the arteries. So I think soy has a lot going for it when it comes to heart health, but it's just one food that you would include in a heart healthy diet. And generally, diets that reduce risk of heart disease are the same diets that reduce risk of other chronic diseases as well.
And what about the effects of soy protein and isoflavones on thyroid function, for example? I understand that's been studied for quite a long time as well. Any concerns there for either healthy individuals or potentially those with hypothyroidism?
No, and thanks for asking that question. So the first animal study looking at the effects of soy on thyroid function was published in 1933, so almost 100 years now. And I'll try to be real quick with this. The clinical studies show in people with normal functioning thyroids, absolutely no adverse effects on thyroid function. This was also the conclusion of the European Food Safety Authority and the German Research Foundation. And a meta-analysis published in 2019, a statistical analysis of the clinical trials, showed no adverse effects or no effects, I should just say, on the two main thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. There was a concern based on a British study published in 2011 that if you had a condition called subclinical hypothyroidism, so you have normal thyroid function and then low thyroid function where you would actually need to take medication, there's a condition in between that called subclinical hypothyroidism. And this one study published in 2011 showed that if you consume soy, you are more likely to go from this subclinical condition to overt hypothyroidism, so low thyroid function where you would need medication. But then it was repeated in 2018, and they used a larger dose, and they found no ill effects. And in fact, what they found was not only no effects in thyroid function, but when you look at both studies, they found a reduction in blood pressure and a reduction in inflammation. And the final comment will be that, so I think people with that condition can clearly consume soy. The remaining issue is if you actually are on thyroid medication, can you consume soy? And food in general, calcium supplements, fiber supplements, many drugs and herbs inhibit the absorption of the medication. So if you are on medication, you can still consume soy foods. It's advised that you separate the time at which you take the medication from the time at which you consume soy. And that would be true for all foods. So you generally take the medication in a fasting condition, and then you would wait a while before you consume soy if you were having it for breakfast.
So some of our guests from previous episodes that we have contacted us since listening and had a little bit of concern about soy and its potential for being an endocrine disruptor. Could you maybe expand on that topic for us a little bit?
Yes, I would love to, because that topic has actually recently occupied about 2 years of my life. So in brief, an endocrine disruptor is a compound. It could be synthetic, natural, something in the pollution, a synthetic chemical, foods we eat, in the water we drink. These are compounds that, in brief, can sort of disrupt the hormonal balance. And there was concerns based on animal studies, and I want to emphasize that they were based on animal studies, that the isoflavones could be endocrine disruptors. So I was recently a co-author of a paper with 9 other soy experts. It's about 30,000 words, hundreds of references that looked at this concern. And fortunately, as I mentioned before, in the case of soy, you have hundreds of clinical studies. With BPA, which we mentioned before, bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disruptor, you can't give BPA you can't use it in a clinical trial. But you can use soy foods and isoflavones, and you have all the observational studies as well. And we literally looked at every concern that was raised about soy, from puberty onset to effects in utero, consuming soy during pregnancy, to male feminization, breast cancer, thyroid function, endometrial cancer. And we concluded this paper is open access, so anybody can download it if they have are so inclined and have the time. And we concluded that neither soy nor isoflavones are endocrine disruptors. I think we very satisfactorily have addressed that concern. Subtle differences in compounds can result in huge differences in physiological effects. So if you think of something like cholesterol and phytosterols, so phytosterols are cholesterol's cousins. They're found in plants, and cholesterol is found in animal foods. Those two chemicals have almost identical chemical structures. And yet, if you take large amounts of dietary cholesterol, you're going to raise your blood cholesterol levels modestly. If you consume phytosterols a couple of grams per day, you're going to lower your cholesterol 10%. So small differences in chemical structure can have huge differences in physiological effects. So when you look at, isoflavones may look like other endocrine disruptors, and therefore we should be concerned, that's not a reasonable, that's logical, but then you have to look at the clinical studies. And when you look at the clinical studies, the evidence is really overwhelming. There are a couple of areas where I would like more research to be conducted. Relatively little research has been conducted involving children because it's harder than heck, to actually conduct a clinical trial involving children. I will say, though, there have been 6 studies looking at the cholesterol-lowering effects of soy protein in children. Most of the 3 of them have been from Austria, and they all show a cholesterol-lowering effect. I mentioned before that there's some pretty exciting data indicating that if girls consume soy, they will reduce their risk of breast cancer later on in life. So I recommend that girls and boys consume soy. The 2 most important studies for puberty onset were conducted by Seventh-day Adventist researchers here in the States against Adventists. About 40% of Adventists are vegetarians. Those are very reassuring about puberty onset. So I think the data are pretty clear, and I'm glad to be able to emphasize that point. And I would recommend those who are really interested to read the paper.
Yeah, when you say it was comprehensive, it really was. It was 63 pages long, including references. So like bedtime reading.
We'll put a link to that in the show notes, actually. It is, like you say, if you've got the time and the head
really
for it.
Thorough.
But even just to scan and just read the abstracts and the outcomes, it's quite reassuring.
And I'll tell you, sorry for interrupting. If some of your listeners have some questions, if they want to email you, if you want to forward them to me, I'd be happy to address those.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you so much.
Sure.
That's really generous.
On that note, you've spoken about the benefits of a serving of soy a day. What is a serving, and is there a difference between fermented and unfermented? So, if we're talking about tofu versus, say, tempeh.
Yeah, good question. So most of the clinical studies intervene with an amount of isoflavones that's provided by about 2 servings. Now, 1 serving is better than none. And, if you're going from a really heavy carnivorous type diet, two servings will be a challenge. But I would like to see people consume 2 servings per day. And when I refer to a serving, I'm referring to, a cup of soy milk is 1 serving. That's 250 milliliters. Basically, about 100 grams of tofu, which is what I would say like a half a cup. An ounce of soy nuts. So it's the general serving sizes that you would use in Australia or the USDA would list for other foods. And I think 2 servings per day is ideal. Now, I will point out that many of the proposed benefits are thought to be due to isoflavones, so the alleviation of hot flushes, maybe bone health, effects on the arteries, even for breast cancer prevention. It's thought to be due to isoflavones. Most of the meat substitutes are very low in isoflavones because during processing, as much as 90% of the isoflavones can be lost. Now, I still eat those products all the time because they're wonderful sources of protein. But if you're strictly shooting for isoflavones, that's not the ideal choice. And in terms of the type of food, so, at a personal level, I would say tempeh is my favorite food, and favorite soy food. And I've been fortunate to be in Indonesia several times, where it's really inexpensive and you can get it everywhere. Tends to be more expensive, and I don't know, at least in the States, it's relatively expensive, but it goes a long way. It has a great taste, great texture. It's got the whole bean. There was that one activist group that I mentioned almost an hour ago now that had a lot to do with disparaging the reputation of soy, promoted this myth that Asians only eat fermented soy. And the amazing thing about that is it's so easily proven wrong, and yet they still continue to say that. Now, I'm excluding soy sauce because that's a condiment, not a food. But most soy consumed in the world is actually consumed in unfermented form because the ethnic Chinese, so folks in China, Singapore, Hong Kong, do not really consume much in the way of fermented soy products. Their main foods are tofu and soy milk. In Japan, it's about 50-50. So tofu, for unfermented and for fermented, a product called natto, which isn't really consumed too much outside of Japan, and miso, which is an excellent food. So most soy consumed around the world is an unfermented form. I think there's probably very little difference in terms of health effects. There are some changes that occur with fermentation that one could speculate may be a health advantage, but the data are pretty flimsy, and you still get the protein. Regardless of whether it's fermented or unfermented, you're still going to get isoflavones. The isoflavones are in a slightly different form when they're fermented. I don't think that's very relevant. It's often said that the protein is more digestible from fermented products, but the protein from tofu and soy milk and soy protein isolate, the concentrated forms of protein, really highly digestible, more than 90%, which is why soy is such a high quality protein. So to me, eat the food that you like, that you enjoy.
So that has been really fascinating. Just to close out the episode, could you give us a little bit of an inside scoop on some of the upcoming projects that you're working on? You've got some fascinating work on the go in regards to skin health and wrinkles. I'm very interested in that.
Most people are. It's funny because you can talk about heart disease and osteoporosis and all these, and the cognitive function. Well, that's a big one. And then when you mention wrinkles, it's like, hey, what was that? What was that?
Yeah.
Is that how strong?
The volume's just gone up, and now they're listening.
It's funny. So the evidence is actually pretty darn intriguing. So first of all, recognize that the skin has estrogen receptors. And there are two types of estrogen receptors. It's been shown in at least one study, the type of receptors in the skin, estrogen receptors in the skin that dominate, is the type of estrogen receptor that isoflavones really like. So there's a basis for speculating that if you consume isoflavones, they're going to eventually make their way to the skin, bind to the estrogen receptors, and exert a beneficial effect. Now, interestingly, if you Google soy and skin creams, you're going to get pages and pages of products that actually include soy for topical administration. But I'm a nutritionist. They may work, but I'm a nutritionist, so I'm concerned about the effect of consuming soy foods and isoflavones. There have been 8 studies that have looked at the effects of isoflavones on skin health, most of which focus specifically on wrinkles. All of those studies have shown beneficial effects, but there's a huge caveat. All of those studies have had design limitations which prevent any kind of definitive conclusions from being made. But the evidence was sufficiently strong for the Soy Nutrition Institute, which is an organization that I work for, has actually funded a 2-year study to the cost of about $400,000 US, looking specifically at the effects of isoflavone-rich soy on skin health. And I would say that if the results are robust, and we'll know in another year, maybe less, if the results are robust, those results combined with the existing literature will allow people like me to pretty strongly conclude or recommend soy for skin health. So I'm pretty excited about that, and I'm optimistic. Otherwise, the institute would not have funded a study, for $400,000. So yeah, it looks pretty good. We have a couple of others in the works looking at the effects of soybean oil on liver disease and metabolic function, also some soy foods. Those are a little bit more difficult to talk about in a short period of time. So the skin study is really the one that I'm most interested in. There's also some data for cognitive function. We don't have any. I'm not aware of any studies that are underway, but there have been quite a few studies that have shown an improvement in visual and short-term memory. So I think, it's hard to definitively prove things. You know that from doing your show. It's hard to do good clinical studies, and people differ. And when you're intervening with diet or nutrition. The studies are often very small in size. So you've got the large observational studies, involving tens of thousands of people, but they're not designed to show cause and effect. So you take an observational finding and then you test it clinically. And those studies can cost millions of dollars. And you have to worry about compliance. If you were to ask Australians who don't consume soy to start to consume 2 cups of soy milk or 2 servings of tofu per day, how long, what would compliance be like a year later? And if you're looking at some of these chronic disease endpoints, you need to go out for a long period of time. So it's difficult. These studies are often small, people vary. So you have to take the totality of the data, and that's what I try to do when I present information about soy, and what I've tried to do here.
Yeah, it's quite obvious that you take the hierarchy of evidence into account. So thank you for being so thorough with everything you've shared.
It's been absolutely fascinating, and on behalf of all our listeners, including myself and Emma, a big sigh of relief. Soy is going to continue being consumed. For me personally, it's soy milk in my porridge. It's, I use it in my baking, tofu, tempeh. I love having that as an alternative when eating out. So continue as per normal. We've covered so many health benefits, certainly busted a lot of myths, which is important. And now this new thing, longevity. I mean, these wrinkles, they're going to be gone. So I'll increase my servings. But no, thank you so much, Mark, for being so forthcoming, so accessible, so readily available to come onto the show and share such a wealth of knowledge, such an important topic that I think this should have been one of the very first episodes we ever had, because it is very commonly brought up in a lot of presentations that both Emma and I do when we interact with a lot of groups of people. It's always, but what about this? What about that? And it's always relating to soy. So thank you so much for really just shedding a lot of, I was going to swear on this, but I won't, so kids can still listen to the podcast, but a lot of the BS out there, and instilling a lot of confidence in such powerful food. And just lastly, when referring to the blue zone areas of the world, the Okinawan diet is very rich in foods that's made with soy, such as tofu and miso, and they consume an average of about 85 grams per day of soy. So, one of the highest rates of centenarians, and they're consuming soy without a problem. There's no reason why we can't. So thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Oh, thank you for giving this opportunity.
Thank you for listening to the Lentil Intervention Podcast. If you found this interesting, make sure you subscribe and share it with your friends.